Good evening and welcome. I see that some of you all are just entering as the webinar allows you all to come in. So I'll give us a few moments before we get started so that everyone can get in the room, in the virtual space, and then I will introduce our speakers. So just hang tight for a moment. Thank you. All right, and my participant clicker seems to be slowing down a bit, so I'll go ahead and get started so that we can give our guests their full time. Good evening and welcome to the Art Museum of West Virginia University's interdisciplinary evening of poetry and photography, Come As You Are. My name is Heather Harris and I am the museum's educational programs manager, and I'll be your host here tonight. Before we begin, a few technical notes. First, we are live captioning this event, so if you wish to avail yourself of that option, you can just hit the closed captioning button on your Zoom software, usually along the bottom, although sometimes on the top, depending on which device you are on. Likewise, we will be using the Q&A function for questions after the presentation. I will be monitoring it throughout, so if there's anything that is urgently related to the presentation, I can jump in, but otherwise we'll have time to talk afterwards with our two speakers. So please use the Q&A rather than the chat. If you have any pressing technical issue, you can put it in the chat and I will see if I can help you resolve it from our end. But we are reserving that for technical issues. The other note I would like to say is that in order to get the best experience tonight, we urge you to put your Zoom on full screen if you are able to, because that will give you the best view of the photographs and images that our speakers are going to be sharing tonight. All right, so with those pieces of business out of the way, it's my honor to give a little background on our guests today. Matt Eich is a photographic essayist working in long-form projects related to community, memory, and family. He's the author of 4 monographs of photography, and he teaches at the Corcoran School of the Arts and Design at the George Washington University. His photographs are also featured in the Art Museum's current exhibition, In Conversation with Walker Evans, for photographers. So we encourage any of you who are local and able to come to the Art Museum during our opening hours, Friday through Sunday, to reserve a time slot and come do that so that you can see Matt's work in person. Doug Van Gundy is an associate professor of English at West Virginia Wesleyan University. His first book of poetry, A Life Above Water, was published in 2007, and his poems and essays have appeared in the Oxford American, Ecotone, and the Fretboard Journal. This evening, Matt and Doug are here to talk about their work together of making photographs and poetry in Webster County, West Virginia, and the collaborative processes of merging the visual and the linguistic. So we hope that you all will enjoy what they have to say. And at this time, I'll invite Matt and Doug to join me on screen and get started with their presentation. Welcome.
Thanks, Heather.
Thanks for the introduction, Heather. Thanks to everybody for coming out this evening. I hope everybody is managing to stay warm, no matter where you are. And we are going to hope for the best on the technical front. It's always a little bit of a guessing game with Zoom, but I'm going to begin sharing my screen, and hopefully people can see this with minimal distractions. But welcome. This is Come As You Are. I'm Matt Eich, joined by Doug Van Gundy. I'm chatting with you all from my windowless basement studio in Charlottesville, Virginia. Where are you today, Doug?
I'm in my wonderful barn roof sided TV room in my house along the beautiful Tigers Valley River in Elkins, West Virginia.
Well, I was really fortunate to be able to visit your home when we were in the process of making this work. One of these introductory pictures was made from your front window, but a little bit of background on how this collaboration came to be. I've been working on long form photo essays about America for, I'd say, the last 15 years. And a number of assignments that I've done for editorial publications have taken me to West Virginia over the years. And rarely do these assignments allow for much time to really plug in and listen in the way that I prefer to do when I'm working. And often editorial publications are pretty succinct in what they put out, and it's difficult to convey nuance in the limitations of that medium. So over the years, I became really interested in trying to slow down my process a bit, spend more time listening. And I've also become more attuned to the influence of poetry on my own practice, and certainly been drawing more and more inspiration from that in the past few years. So a few years ago, I was contacted by the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and they suggested that I go make some work in West Virginia. And I suggested that I would really love to work with a poet, and Alyssa Court, the director of EHRP, was familiar with Doug's work and put us in touch. And a matter of weeks after we made contact, I was pulling up in his driveway just outside of his home in Elkins, West Virginia, and we were embarking on this journey together. So we've just got a couple introductory pictures and then a little kind of introduction to Doug's practice and my practice, and then we will dive into the deeper collaboration. But I'll turn it over to you for a beat here, Doug.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. So Matt's given you sort of the background on how we came to be together and to work together. I teach at West Virginia Wesleyan College, where I direct the graduate creative writing program, the MFA program. And I've been writing poems about West Virginia since I was in junior high school, but it took going away and moving. I'm from Elkins, from Randolph County. It took going off to the University of Utah and living away from the state for a number of years before I really felt compelled to try to capture my experience and the experience of my fellow West Virginians in poetry. And then as someone who teaches on the college level, I also teach Appalachian Lit as well as creative writing and humanities courses. And I became really interested, having been away, really interested in the idea of this single Appalachian story, the single West Virginia story that is so dangerous, where we have these reductionist sort of narratives. And so I've always been interested in trying to show what I see as a kind of a documentarian, showing what I see honestly, good and the bad, the things that conform to the cliche and the things that defy it. And so when Matt and I sat down that first evening in my house and started talking about what we wanted to bring to this, it became apparent pretty quickly that we had kind of aligned ethoses, that we both wanted to listen, we wanted to document community, we wanted to walk in with our eyes and our ears open and let our experiences in Webster County really dictate the work that we made. I'm also a traditional musician, and you're going to hear some of that music tonight, but my process of learning to play traditional music from older people and going out and visiting folks in their homes and sort of meeting people that I didn't know but knew of in order to try to meet the older generation of musicians, I think probably served us well in our experiences in Webster County.
So this picture was made out of Doug's front window in his home early one morning before we set out to roll around the hills of Webster County. This time feels far removed from where we currently are, and I am longing for the opportunity to get back on the road and just to meet strangers and to hear other people's stories and experiences. But in the meantime, we will make do with what we have, and I'm grateful for this chance to experiment and try and push this collaboration a little further. So you all have a little introduction to Doug's background, where he's coming from. We have a short selection of some of his poems that relate to this idea of home and pushing back against that singular Appalachian narrative. And I'm going to kind of move through these text slides as Doug reads the poems. I'm going to go ahead and take myself off camera so that there are minimal distractions and we can focus on what's being presented.
Thanks, Matt. So these are all poems. These poems here were all made outside of the context of our collaboration, but offer perhaps a little insight into what I do and how I do it and what I'm trying to achieve with it. So this is a poem that is, for lack of a better term, a ladder poem. So the first 11 lines occur in the inverse order in the second half. You'll see how it works. But I had this idea of sort of archaeology, peeling away layers and then putting them back, and how experiencing the layers of a story influences how we see that story forevermore. This is called A People's History of Randolph County, West Virginia. Imagine how it used to be. All that remains now are stones and ghosts. You can't look at the old topographical maps and see the places where the miners used to live. Even the names of the settlements are missing. Jeff Scott's, Laurel, Roaring Creek Junction. If you go there today, bushwhack through briars and Joe Pie, you will have to dig into the ground to find anything to prove that people ever even lived here. To prove that people ever even lived here, dig into the ground. To find anything, you'll have to bushwhack through briars and Joe Pie if you go there today. Jeff Scott's, Laurel, Roaring Creek Junction, even the names of the settlements are missing, the places where the miners used to live. Look at the old topographical maps and see. All that remains now are stones and ghosts. You can't imagine how it used to be. This is an erasure poem. This again plays with it, the idea of that single story. This is an erasure of 2 pages from a book called Our Southern Highlanders that was published in 1913 by a fellow by the name of Horace Kephart. And these are pages in which he talks about West Virginia. So I've erased his words that I didn't think resonated and found this sort of shadow story beneath. Horace Kephart's idea of West Virginia corrected. The Highlanders here mentioned, all those West Virginia souls, constitute a distinct people, closely akin in speech, in needs, identical, vast. There is no America, these mountaineers segregated from all others. Strange, they do not know their isolation. I can think of no other to which they may be likened. The peculiar weakness of the Highlanders, an undying devotion to their homes. Tear away from his native rock, and all are stricken with homesickness beyond cure. They will return, however poor. Here then is Appalachia, more American by blood than America, less affected by progress than any part of the English-speaking world. Such an anomaly has discovered the mountains. And, however hallowed, the mountaineer sees his forests leveled, his rivers dammed. He is dazed by vast transfers of property, incensed by rude demands. He realizes with sinking heart a sudden end of his ancestors and his neighbors. All this insults the established order of the universe. What is the good of this? These stuck-up strangers. He observes them. He contrasts his ragged self, never acknowledged. He turns. And finally, a more personal one. This is called Last Thoughts on Electronic Voice Projection. And electronic voice projection is the idea that you can hear the voices of the dead in sort of the hiss of tape recordings or in signals that are retrieved from outer space. At any rate, I thought that idea of being able to hear sort of the garbled voices of the past played well with our sense of a little bit of ancestor worship, and a little bit of sentimentality. Last thoughts on electronic voice projection. My grandmother calls less and less frequently since she died, and when she does, it's always to complain. She's cold, she's hungry, the coroner has made a mistake, that sort of thing. I listen as patiently as I can. I am still in love with the music of her voice. While she was alive, she'd sing big band standards in her nasal soprano, the whole time stuffing pork chops or washing the dishes, until I'd slip an arm around her back and waltz her around the linoleum. Me taking over the singing, she giggling like a little girl and dripping soap from the waterlogged rag in her hand. Now her voice is ossifying through the degrees, getting thinner and thinner. Now FM, now AM. Finally, she will open her mouth on the wordless static of the stationless radio or interstellar space. One day, I'll answer the phone and hear even less than the background sound of the line, only the silence behind the silence, my memory of her having gone as voiceless as a doll.
Okay. Doug, thanks for sharing your poems that kind of led you up to this collaboration. I'm going to share just a few images from a series called Carry Me, Ohio. I was born in Virginia and raised in the southeastern part of the state, growing up mostly in Suffolk, Smithfield, kind of rural peanut farming communities. In 2004, I began studying photojournalism at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, which is on the kind of southeastern border of the state border in West Virginia. So I passed through West Virginia every time I went from home to school and back, and saw little slivers of the landscape in transit. And it felt very reminiscent of the landscape that I was experiencing around college at the time. So this body of work began as a series of projects for school and expanded beyond that. Ran for about 10 years before it was published in book form. The Art Museum at West Virginia University currently has 6 of these images on view as part of their exhibition accompanying Walker Evans' photographs. So I think of these pictures as kind of the training ground or preparation for what led me to Doug eventually. But while making this work, this was kind of in the years of the recession when the opioid epidemic was really wreaking havoc on this region. I was primarily focused on a couple family groups in Chansey, Gloucester, Cheshire, places like that. And some of these families I've managed to maintain contact with over the years, and some I lost contact with not long after making this work. But these pictures are drawn from a 10-year period of time. And these experiences in southeastern Ohio definitely informed my desire to spend more time in that area, to understand it more deeply, and to try and approach it with more nuance. So the title of this work, Carry Me, Ohio, comes from a song by Sunkill Moon. And Doug is providing some musical accompaniment with some of the notes from that song in the background right now. So another kind of shared element of our practices is a deep, abiding love of music and its influence on both the way I make photographs and the way I sequence photographs and put them together in book or exhibition form. And of course, music deeply influences Doug's craft as well, the way that he shapes his poems. So this was something that we found as common ground as we were rolling around Webster County, playing music for one another, Doug reciting poems for me. So these are just 6 images from that larger body of work, also currently on view at the museum for those who are able to see it in person. But at this point, we're going to transition into sharing our collaboration. Doug will be visible on camera. I'm going to go off camera again for this, again, just to provide minimal distractions. And we will do our best to keep things moving along on pace. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Doug.
All right. This is a poem from the collaboration that takes its name from one of the coal camps in Webster County called Burgoo. These mountains have stopped swallowing men and spitting them back out, bruised by what they've seen and done. The men are gone, minds emptied, drift mouths mute. Coal camp names remain: Burgoo, Par Coal, Diana, stripped, half-sung litany of used to be. On the night of the fire, the Oakland Hotel, the town's last, abandoned for a decade, proved the fire marshal right by burning to the ground. Embers winged in air, ash drifting back to earth as far away as the courthouse steps and Elk River Road. Theories swirled, started by vagrants, meth heads, the mayor, accident or arson. The heat so great siding melted from buildings. Insulation dripped from TV cables, telephone wires. Green leaves curled into brown on oaks halfway up the hillside. People wandered from their homes, drawn to the light, until half the town watched in pajamas and sweatpants. Dogs barked for hours and hours afterward, just in case we missed the message. A West Virginia prayer. Thou of the tin can cut, Martha White self-rising communion wafer, who turned the milk to buttermilk, whose blood was turned to elderberry wine, whose countenance shines more golden than the stood-up yolk of a lay-this-morning egg lifted from the feathered nest of a Wyandotte hen, we beseech thee, hear our prayer. Save us, O Lord, from this other God, the one of the heavy weather and floodwaters floating our furniture away, the one whose angels are indistinguishable from our meth-martyred children, the one who blesses the well-intentioned oil and gas companies who have found a way to further destroy your creation, our home. Leave us, we pray, our pole beans and trout streams. Leave us a desire to remember recipes, old music, and stories. Restore in us the ability to tell a son of a bitch politician who wants to help us from one who doesn't give a good goddamn about us. Leave us, we pray, enough self-respect to say no now and then, or just leave us. Hymn for Coal Smoke. Praise the antique odor, wood smoke compressed and marinated in subsea strata and mountain hillsides to a richer, sharper smell, incense burned on an ancient animal altar. Praise the thready column in chilly air, slow to dissipate, almost an entity in and of itself, black stone burnt to yellow smoke and snow-white ash. Praise the sweat inside the scent, sweetness of the human animal, salt of its labor, blood smell in the mineral dark. Verge. A fawn lies speckled and dead at the side of the highway. The trees around her draped with black birds waiting for traffic to pass and half a chance to land. The tragedy isn't how young this thing is, or even that it is dead. The only tragedy is that the deer, whether buck, doe, or fawn, have an arrogance and an ignorance equal to their beauty. They don't believe the car can kill them. They have no idea when to get out of the road, or even where the forest ends and the road begins. When a crow is eating along the highway, he keeps a nervous, constant eye on all comings and goings, knows the time to fly to a low branch or hop onto the verge to let a semi-truck ruffle his feathers as it hurtles past. We are not the deer here. We are the crows. We know these roads and what to fear and what to avoid. We know where we belong, survive on what we must, and will disappear into the woods in a blink of an eye, without a sound, wingtips never touching a tree. Home Burial, a love poem. Please, don't allow any strangers to lie on this ridge or any backhoes to dig into this ground. I need you to make a shovel-opened, shoulder-pried grave for me when I go. Box me, don't burn me. Store me away in a hillside I know like my bones. Dig down to a clay floor so water won't get in too easy. While I want to die quickly, I want my body to linger as long as it can, at least a century between box and bare bones. There is no way you can bury me without entering the earth yourself. You need to know that worm's eye view. Feel the blade of the spade slicing through roots of unknowable plants. See the rectangle of trapped sky from the bottom of my grave. Make certain it's safe enough, deep enough, square enough to hold my eternity. Once I'm packaged and lowered, the preacher has intoned his boilerplate, and you have heaped your plate with fried chicken and pie. Shovel me covered. After you do this, there is nothing I will not do for you. I believe in the body, not its resurrection.
Well, that is what we have for you all this evening in terms of visuals, music, and poetry. And
Thank you.
yeah, thank you all for being with us, bearing with us.
Yeah, so we would like now to invite people to use that Q&A function to ask any questions to Matt and Doug during this time. We still have a few minutes, so if there's anything that you would like to ask, I'm going to be checking the Q&A box. We just had a one pop up. And it was just an appreciation. We've actually had a couple appreciations of just talking about how powerful this has been and how excited people were to see it. So I think that that's the overwhelming response. But now in the form of a question, Amber would like to know a little bit more about process. So you talked briefly about kind of how you came together and connections, but maybe a little bit more in detail how as a collaborative process you work together, maybe the back and forth.
Well, it all started with was it a phone call or an email, Doug? I feel like I might have emailed you and then you called me and I was taking a really rare nap that afternoon. I remember
Right.
being awakened by a call from a West Virginia number and I wasn't sure who it was and answered and I was a bit groggy, but was, instantly struck with the compatibility of the project and kind of excited to see where we
Yep.
could take it from there. You want to talk a little bit about the kind of back and forth process? There's the in the field, but then after is kind of equally important in terms of exchanging pictures and poems and kind of letting one thing lead to the next.
Right. And in the field, we were together. we were I'm sorry, I'm where the connection's a little spotty here. We were working together. So when we were going out and meeting folks, I was recording them and asking them questions. Matt was too, but I was asking most of the questions and Matt was making photographs. And we would talk. It's about almost a 2-hour drive, hour and 45-minute drive from Elkins, hour and a half from Elkins to Webster Springs. And so we spent 2 full weeks going over to Webster from here. And so we ended up talking a lot on the way over about what we wanted to achieve each day and talking on the way back about what we had seen. And then after we went our separate ways and Matt went home, we would send things. I would send poems and Matt would send me photographs. And his photographs informed my revisions of the poems. And I'll let him speak to whether or not the poems informed his selection of the photographs.
It certainly did, because occasionally there are pictures that I might overlook in a first pass, and then a line in a poem or something kind of caused me to go back and revisit the image. But part of the process was I would make some work prints, kind of small 4x6s, and send you some of my favorites. We also put together kind of like a shared web page where, as you sent drafts of poems, I would plug them in amongst the pictures, and we began to kind of see how things were interacting with one another that way, but never really having a set expected outcome. Through the EHRP, we were partnered with The Guardian, which published kind of an excerpt of the photographs and the poems. And so as we started working with their team, that gave a little more form to the collaboration for that outlet, but we knew that it wasn't going to end there, that it was something that we wanted to continue and expand upon. And I think we're both dreamers at heart. So, a lot of the driving was just like, what could this be in the best case scenario? And that was kind of the fun part of this, is that, at least, from my vantage point as a freelance photographer, it's usually the limitations of time and that constrains things. And we were trying to give ourselves a degree of freedom, which we are rarely granted. And that freedom was just to go with little expectation and to be led by the people that we met, and to try and hear what was important to them and follow their lead as best we could, instead of, as is often the case, kind of entering a space that you do not belong to and projecting assumptions on the people that live there. That's what we wanted to actively work against in our collaborative process.
It's one of the reasons that we chose Webster County also, is because it is a place that has the same economic issues as a lot of places in the state, but it's not somewhere that's been visited a lot. It's not a go-to location for editors who say, oh, I need something about West Virginia, go to, and there are a couple of locales, I won't single them out, but there are a couple of places that editors send people. And so we wanted to go someplace that hadn't really been covered. The other thing just about the collaboration is, of course, Matt and I were, because we were working at the same time and we were together in the same space, he was responding to what we were seeing and the people we were talking to through his photographs, and I was responding in the notes I was taking and the poems I was drafting. And so we started at the same place and at the same time. And then sometimes I would see Matt's photos and they would remind me of something from the trip, that I would pull into the poems. Just like Matt said, there sometimes would be an image or a detail in the poem that would draw him back to a photograph that maybe he had overlooked.
And I think there are actually several questions that popped up as you were talking, and I don't want to ignore them, but I also think some of them were answered in your answer to this first one, because a lot of people were really interested in sort of timeline. Someone asked if Matt saw Doug's poems first and then made photographs, or you made photographs and then poems. But I think I hear you saying that it was really kind of, you were both making and doing simultaneously, and then went back and forth to kind of see where the resonances were. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of our practices can tend to be kind of isolating and lonely. Writing poetry is a pretty solitary task, and oftentimes making pictures can be as well. I'm also a bit of an introvert, and sometimes when I'm in a place that I'm unfamiliar with, it's really hard for me to just like force myself out of that space and to interact with strangers. So I feel like when working in tandem, we were able to develop a pretty good rhythm of, how we approached and introduced and kind of explained ourselves. And then sometimes we could go to a place and scatter, part ways, and both seek out different leads and kind of report back to one another. I met this cool person over here, you got to talk to them. Like, I've got this great poem component of this individual over here, this location, check it out before we leave town. So the reporting that we did together, the project for EHRP, was split up in 2 trips. So there was kind of the bulk of the work done in tandem in the field, and then we went our separate ways, and I spent time with the pictures and Doug spent time crafting the poems. We were sharing stuff in this kind of interim period in between those trips, and then we rejoined at a later point. I believe it was July and December of
That's
2018
right.
that we met up. And so December felt like we were kind of examining what we had gathered before and trying to think about what we were missing, what we really needed to kind of wrap it up to the point of publication, but knowing that, of course, there's no way that we can in any way sum up the experiences of individuals living in West Virginia or, the diversity of this place. So we're just looking for little resonant snippets that feel like they harmonize together and speak to some of these larger threads and themes. But the hope has always been that we'll be able to get back out there together in some form.
And I think some people were also really interested in that connection with the people of Webster County and kind of relationship building. So someone wanted to know if the poems are based on conversations with the people. I mean, some of them seem like, like quite personal experiences and or observations, and where were those lines for you? Doug, maybe in particular, but both.
I apologize. You mentioned the other questions, and so I was half scrolling through them. Can you just restate that real quickly?
Yeah. So, are the poems based on conversations with people, or where the photographs are taken, or observations, or both? Like, kind of, some of those poems seem to recount quite personal experiences, and it's kind of where do those come from?
Sure. So when we met folks, I recorded them, and so I interviewed them and made recordings. I referred back to those recordings when I was at home. Sometimes the there would be a scrap of something someone said, or in some of the poems that aren't included here tonight, there's more voice. There's a couple of voice poems, persona poems that sort of reframe themes and whatnot that people had brought up in their conversations with us. I tried not to present any one person. I didn't want to. One of the things I love about Matt's photography and his practice is he always talks about making pictures, not taking them, which is I think an important distinction. And so I didn't want to be taking people's stories. I wanted to be making stories from the stories that were told, sort of bringing things together. So some of it happened out in the world when we were there. Some images came to me and I drafted them, kept them in a little notebook in my pocket. And then others came from reflection and sort of conflation of a couple of conversations. That's really how my process is, regardless of what I'm working on. Some things happen in the moment and some things happen at a remove.
And along the same question of relationship building, we actually had a couple people ask if you had shared this work with the people who were the people in Webster County, and what their responses were.
Yeah, we have. As a matter of fact, two people who helped us make some connections were friends of mine. One is a student of mine at West Virginia Wesleyan who's from Webster Springs, and another was a former colleague. And so they connected us with people, and I made sure that they had connections to these, and they shared them around. We also put things on Facebook. We asked folks in the moment, told them what we were doing and told them where we were, and that it was going to be, we thought it was going to be in the Guardian, especially I think by the December trip, we knew that we were going to be working with the Guardian. And so these people that I knew sort of ahead of time in Webster Springs, they shared that work, and the people that I've talked to liked it. I've since met people who saw the work that I didn't know them before, and they've come up and said, "Oh, you did that project in Webster Springs." I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but maybe if folks didn't like what we were doing, they didn't come up and tell us. But I've been approached just traveling the state, playing music and doing poetry events and whatnot by folks who've appreciated the project and felt seen, felt that it was. It's funny, we tried to be honest. I noticed there was a question that mentioned something about a tone of sentimentality. And certainly sentimentality is something that I try to avoid, but also get close to. So I think it was the poet William Stafford who said that sentimentality is one of the greatest risks of writing poetry, but it's a risk you should take. You should get close to it, but not, sentimentality is cheap emotion by my definition. And it's not considering the past, it's not looking with fondness, it's not acknowledging the good and the bad. It's cheap sentimentality. Cheap emotion is sentimentality, pulling strings, pushing buttons, not doing the work, not doing the groundwork. But I don't, I try to avoid sentimentality. So if the work comes off as sentimental, we really just, for my part, the pieces came from asking people to tell their stories. What do you like about this place? What are problems? What brought you back? Why did you stay? Those kind of questions. And maybe the questions led to answers that verged on sentimentality. But I don't know, the fact that that going to places like Burgoo, where there were 3 or 4 mines in operation, now there are none. And you can see places where the vines have grown up through buildings that used to be occupied by people. I don't think it's sentimental to acknowledge that there was something here, and now the thing that's here is not the thing that was here. There's still something there. And that's important to recognize also.
And I think this would be more of a question for Matt, maybe, but for both of you. I mentioned, Matt, that your work is on display in our exhibition In Conversation with Walker Evans, and someone was wondering about what Walker Evans might mean to you, or how you see that connection in your work. So I know that might be a big question, but it's definitely relevant to the work we have on display right now. So I thought I would throw it at you.
Sure. Well, Evans is obviously a kind of larger than life figure in American photography, in its history and in its present. He shaped the work of Frank, and Frank shaped the work of Eugene Richards. And I'd say Eugene Richards is probably my largest influence, but I still look at Frank and Evans for cues from time to time. When I'm thinking about the way that Evans approached photography, he wanted it to be, his stated goal for his work was that it be literate, authoritative, and transcendent. And I think those are good qualities to ascribe to, or to attempt in one's work. He had a kind of coldness and remove from his pictures that provides some critical distance, perhaps, but lacks some of the warmth and intimacy that I personally desire in photographs. So that's one area in which I think I might diverge from his practice, but I'm still actively studying him and trying to learn from him as I photograph some of the areas that he was documenting nearly 100 years ago. And I have not been able to keep up with all of the Q&A questions, but I did see a couple questions related to kind of the end goal of the work, if such a thing exists. And this is still very much an ongoing conversation that Doug and I are having. Some other questions previously had been about kind of the accessibility of the work to the community depicted, which is something that is of great concern to us, because we know that while people can access The Guardian for free online, not everybody's got access to the internet or will even care to see it, right? So this is one of the things that we're constantly trying to reckon with as visual storytellers, communicators, is how to reach across this kind of increasing void between different segments of our society. So the plan that Doug and I have been rolling out for a little while now is multifaceted, and the hope would be that in the end, whatever the collaboration turns out to be, I don't think we're done yet. I'm hoping that this will continue rolling. But whatever materials, pictures, poems, sound are gathered could be archived somewhere and accessible to the public. That's an ideal situation. But we also would like to be printing some probably newsprint publications that we can distribute for free in the areas in which we're working, just dropping stacks off in gas stations and doctors' offices so people can have these little collections of pictures and poems and take them home with them, because that's one way that the work can live in a physical way. And then we've also talked about the idea of kind of pop-up pseudo-guerrilla style public installations where we're pasting pictures and poems in public spaces. Obviously, there's a lot of moving pieces involved in that, so something that's been a little out of reach in the present moment, but something that I personally still would aspire to if we can keep it rolling. But that's our hope.
Wonderful. And thanks, Matt. And you don't need to feel like you need to keep up with the Q&A. I'm happy to kind of lob them over to you. But yes, several people were interested in where this work might go next, whether it be a book or a zine or something auditory. Someone mentioned, MP3s, podcasts, and moving to the auditory, we also had several questions about the music. So I have to say that I love interdisciplinary work, and I was really excited to invite Matt and Doug here today for, because I knew about their visual and written collaboration. I did not know that we were going to have a musical accompaniment as well from Doug, which was a pleasant surprise to me as I started to talk to them about their planning. So some people were interested, Doug, first just in what you were playing, kind of where those tunes come from and maybe why they resonate with both the words and images.
Sure.
And maybe just a little bit about how that third modality works in with this already collaborative work.
So the first piece I played on the electric guitar was Carry Me Ohio from Sun Kill Moon. But the tune I played on the banjo is called Bonaparte's Retreat. And I chose that because I knew of a version of that tune. It's a very widely played tune, but I knew a version of that from a Webster County fiddler, and so it was in the back of my head. The tune I played on the mandolin is called Cranberry Rock, and the Cranberry River flows through Webster County, but it's a tune from the Hammonds family, the musical Hammonds family, who were from the sort of border area around Webster and Pocahontas County. And their music is a great influence to me. I lived in Pocahontas County for 11 years. And then the fiddle tune was a tune that's called Pretty Little Indian that was played by a man named Ward Jarvis, who was from Braxton County, but who lived over next to Athens, Ohio. He had moved over to Ohio. And so it felt like a connection to the Carry Me Ohio work and Matt's connections to Southeast Ohio, and a connection from West Virginia and Southeast Ohio. So that was sort of the intellectual end of it, but also I chose each of the pieces because I thought they had sort of an emotional resonance and a drone that I really like drone in music. And so it's one of the things I love about old time music, old time fiddling in particular, is that it's got a lot of open droning strings. But there's a pensiveness to that, to the traditional music of West Virginia, I think, that I felt to me like it fit with this work.
Thank you. And so we only have a couple minutes left. I'm afraid we're not going to get to every single question that's already in the Q&A. So if you have something burning, you can send it, and then I can try and get you an answer if you want to send your email or things like that. But I'm going to make time for maybe two more. Since we just talked to Doug a little about music, we had another more technical photography one, and I'm going to go ahead and just read this one so I don't misstate anything in the question askers. Griffin says, I noticed the theme of framing, sometimes intentionally obscuring the subject of the photographs, other times adding a new element. Was this an intentional theme? If so, what were you trying to express and how did it affect the poems?
Good questions. So one of the things that certainly comes up in photography classes, and I've seen a couple student names pop up in the Q&A, so I'm sure they've heard me say this before, but photography is a self-referential medium. It's rectangles and photos with pictures in pictures and frames within frames tend to draw our eye and hold our attention. And so it is a kind of visual compositional tool that I employ pretty regularly in different projects. The kind of theme of obscuring identity is something that I play with from time to time because sometimes I feel like specificity of a person can distract from our ability to imagine and project narrative onto images. And Doug is definitely playing with this kind of projecting narrative and drawing narrative from different sources. So trying to make pictures that are a bit more mysterious and enigmatic and can be in conversation with the poetry. Those are some of the main kind of intentions behind those different approaches. And I'm trying to remember the last part of that question because it was kind of a three-parter.
Well, I think the last part was actually for Doug, because I think it was about how it affected those choices that you just described, the framing, maybe the obscuring, affected, because obviously Doug is seeing and meeting these people outside of the camera frame. So how did those choices by Matt affect the poems maybe that you wrote?
As I mentioned before, the photographs often were, to me, photography and poetry have sort of similar ideas. There's a distillation that happens, and there's this, as Matt was saying, there's this selectivity that's what's in the frame, what's out of the frame, and what's in the poem, what's out of the poem. And so Matt's photographs rather helped me to, once we were both at home and away from Webster County, helped really direct my attention back to things that I might have overlooked. And I guess the advantage to having been there at the time is that his framing was especially obvious to me because I was able to see what was outside of the frame. Sometimes I was just I'm a great fan of photography, and I do a bunch of ekphrastic writing, so I use photos as prompts, Walker Evans among others. But Matt's work, sometimes I was really surprised by what he chose out of the 360 degrees of where we were, like what he honed in on, that just his thought process even informed my thought process when I was writing the poems. His attention directed mine sometimes.
Great. And so, like I said, we're not going to be able to get to every question, and we're actually a little past 7:30, but I'll end us with, I promised 2 more questions. So I'll end us with a doozy, which is, what did making this work with each other teach you about yourself, your creative process, or life in general? So I think that's a good putting a bow on it question, even if it is very, it might be big to grapple with. So I'll leave that with you all.
Well, real quick, to kind of tie into what Doug was just saying about, again, some other parallels between photography and poetry is both are fairly subtractive mediums. You start with a lot and you just narrow down until you kind of reach the most direct or potent form. And I know the person who asked that question, she can ask that of me at any point. I can say that this collaboration with Doug helped to break some kind of creative blockages that I felt from my undergraduate experience and in professional life, working in the kind of editorial system. I felt like I had to be a certain kind of photographer, a certain kind of artist. And working with Doug, I was able to discover a kind of newfound freedom and came back from our first trip and started painting, not with any intention of it being good, but just to express myself through a different mode. And I found that to be incredibly rewarding and something that I'm still processing and cherishing. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Well, for me, it was sort of a dream come true because I do love photography so much, and I've spent so much time sort of looking at photography. And so I'd always wanted to work with a photographer. So when Matt said, "Hey, I kind of want to work with a poet on this," it was kismet. And that desire that had been there for a while, working with Matt really confirmed how fruitful my suspicions that it would be really fruitful. Poetry, even though it's a written medium, so much of our language and the imagery that we use, even the language when we say image, to a visual vocabulary. And
Oh no, we're losing Doug a little bit at the end. We're all waiting with bated breath.
Matt.
So I think I'm going to jump in because Doug's connection is failing us, even when I'm sure that he had wonderful things to say about the collaborative process. I'm just glad that it is held out through his ability to share his words and music with us. And so thank you so much to both Matt and Doug. And I think especially what Matt was saying, both Matt and Doug work at universities, as our museum is also centered at a university. And I think that idea of interdisciplinarity and reaching outside of your fields or comfort zones is an important lesson that we can impart to a lot of our students as they're pursuing their careers. So I was going to let that be the last word, but Doug, if you have anything you want to jump in with to say goodbye, since you seem to be back with a better connection, I'll let you do that too.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'm not sure how much of that went out, but Matt inspired me also to take more photographs and to consider the visual language that is happening in my poems. And I think that that's deepened through the collaboration. And also it's spurred a couple of other collaborations that I've done with other writers and with a storyteller. And so it just has opened the door to collaboration. I really love, interdisciplinary, collaborative. I love work that sort of tosses the ego aside and where you allow someone else to, you sort of steer each other's work and you allow yourself to be influenced. I think that that's just really rich. And so I'm really grateful to Matt for that. And grateful to you, Heather, for hosting us, and to the museum at WVU for hosting us tonight.
Yes, and we're very grateful to you. And I do have to say that there are many comments and questions that were simply appreciations. I said that at the beginning of the Q&A session, but just appreciations for your time and your work and your collaborative spirit. So I will echo all of those and thank everyone for being here. Stay tuned to the Art Museum's website and social media feeds for more events. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thanks again.